Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Dark Pixel Podcast. My name is Mike.
I'm Landon. I'm Jason.
Every time I think I've done everything, right? There's a lot of things to think about. I forgot to replace the title card, so it still said Live Special Episode 100. This is actually Episode 102. And we have our topics laid out as we usually do them on the podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and list those out for you guys. I don't normally list them because usually they're on that title card and you guys can see them. Today, that was a mistake. Our first topic is going to be, is the Final Fantasy VII Remake really in trouble? Kesa made a video yesterday. It's gotten a lot of buzz, actually. A report that was made on a number of websites about a guy named Dan Sakasa who had some insider information or claim to. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. The second topic will be, how do you balance the classic feel of old JRPGs and still bring forward innovations in gameplay? That was from Jared Fight. Ask that one. Our third question comes from Darius. Essentially, he read a book, a Swedish book, that made a claim that video games were objectively better in the 1990s than they were in the following decade. We'll go over that and give our thoughts about whether we agree or disagree with that thought. Then we have Xylon for the fourth topic for today, is asking about how characters should be written in reference to Tales of Vesperia. There are two characters in the lead of that game that give me, at least from his description, a similar vibe to Delita and Ramza from Final Fantasy Tactics. So he's talking about how those characters play off each other, and anyways, we'll get more into that. I'll get more context when we get there. Fifth topic from Brian Gillis. In a cosmic catastrophe, the Final Fantasy series is wiped from existence and the minds of everyone but you. The world is otherwise unchanged. How would you educate people, basically, on what Final Fantasy is, using other existing JRPGs to sort of like tell people about what Final Fantasy is? Interesting question there from Brian Gillis. Final one from Christopher Guin. What's the hardest you've ever laughed while playing a JRPG? Okay.
As hard as I've ever chuckled.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so we are doing this again live. At least I think we're live. Actually, I think I know what the problem is. I think I know exactly what the problem is.
Stream right now.
The problem is that I think it is unlisted currently. So I'm going to change the settings to be public, and then people will start pouring in. And in the meantime, we'll get started on our first topic. Okay, it's public now, so people should be coming in.
All right.
Essentially, what we're going to do, this is going to run like we normally do podcasts, right? This is going to be exactly like our 100 episode where we're taking live questions from the audience. Mm-hmm. We have our topics set up, but in between each topic, we'll take a minute and look at what people are saying, maybe respond to someone quick, or for sure we'll look at our super chats if that comes up, and answer those. But we won't be just like taking questions and topics from the audience necessarily. We're going to stick to the ones we've chosen beforehand from Patreon. Okay. That being said, so Kason, you made the video on Monday regarding this. The article that you were pulling up was from, I think it was the one Power Up.
Though I can't remember what the website was called.
I think it's Power Up, right? The one that had two updates.
Yeah,
two updates at the top about his ArtStation being deleted and all of his Twitter Meta account being deleted and stuff like that.
Updates and how the guy has basically been wiped from the internet.
Yeah. So if anyone,
very strange way.
If anyone is interested,
does that lend credibility, or does that take credibility away? I don't. The fact that he had to scrub his.
This is the article here. Power Up. I'm showing it here on the screen. So if you guys want to take a look at this article, you can. Essentially, it's being written in response to someone named Dan Tsukasa, claims to be a developer working and living in Japan right now, who knows people within both CyberConnect 2, claims to have worked with CyberConnect 2, and also has worked in the past with Square Enix. I'll get into that in a minute. That doesn't say it in the article here.
No, but yeah, we possibly have another big news story for everybody.
we have a counter to possibly Dan Tsukasa as whether his credibility is up,
Yes,
could be.
There's a little more bigger of a question mark now than there was. Just put it that way.
So anyways, in this article, in case I went over this in his video, but he talked about how he knows CyberConnect's level. He's worked with them before. I have it. I'm showing it here. How he knows the work was unusable. That all of the work
useless.
All the work from CyberConnect 2 was completely scrapped. And started over when Square Enix brought Final Fantasy VII Remake in-house. That's basically the claim he's making here. You can read his...
heard, we know the project was taken away from them and brought in-house. We know that Cloud is being redesigned, at the very least. But we don't know that everything got scrapped. I mean, we saw that trailer. That wasn't scrap-worthy. That was good-looking stuff.
Yeah.
That he's suggesting they scrapped all of it. I was a bit surprised to hear that, but
yeah, basically saying that CC2 was outsourcing just to get the assets up to the level where they could be shown publicly in trailers, that they were behind on other deadlines. Anyways, lots of stuff being claimed here. Just so you guys know, that's where that was all being drawn from. So
yeah.
That being said, again, if you haven't seen Kaysen's video from yesterday, go watch it. You can get that take from there.
Yep.
We wanted to talk a little bit about the fact, who is Dan Tsukasa? Why should we believe what he has to say about it?
It's hard to find him now. He's basically has no social media anymore.
It's very hard to verify who the guy is, what he has worked on, what he has done, because all of his social media got deleted, right?
Well, ArtStation, now, how exactly does ArtStation work? Do you need to...
You can follow people who are artists.
Do you need to verify that you work for a company?
No.
Or can you just
I have an ArtStation. And you just say what field you're in.
Yeah. Right. Well.
So you don't have to... So anyone could create an ArtStation account, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's impossible now. It might have been possible a few days ago. It is impossible right now to verify whether this dude is who he says he is, because you can't find him. You can't find him. You can't look into what he's done. He just disappeared. There was speculation about whether he was pressured to do that, because maybe what he was saying was, Square Enix wanted to put a lid on that. The other side might be maybe it was obvious enough that he isn't who he says he is, and so he just freaking trashed everything and ran away.
If he's a troll, why does he care?
It's very strange.
Well, let's explore.
He's not defending himself. He's not doing anything. He's just leaving. Which typically, when that kind of thing happens, it's because of outside pressure. It's because maybe he did get too close to violating an NDA, or maybe his current company is like, stop doing this. The fact that he would have deleted all of his stuff is not something that somebody who's just making it up would do.
He's just afraid of Cambridge Analytica, and he's like, screw all this stuff.
It's I just realized
the internet anymore.
They're taking my stuff.
He deleted his stuff. Right? So, right?
No, I think this was like a few days ago.
Oh, he deleted it a few days ago. Because the post was a month ago.
That post was a month ago. The post from my video was just like 3 days ago. And then 2 days ago, after it got picked up, he...
All right, so he's not worried about Cambridge Analytica.
He might still be worried about
He might still be concerned about that.
Well, okay, so the reason I bring this up is because this morning I received a personal message on Twitter from someone who has spoken with Dan Tsukasa in the past in Reddit threads and found his claims to be suspect.
He doesn't know as much as he says he knows.
Yeah,
and that was displayed pretty well.
I'm going to pull up, just real quickly, I'm going to pull up again this Reddit thread here. And this is on the Final Fantasy VII Remake subreddit. on the posting here is the level planner job listing posted for FF7 Remake. If you come down,
and this was back when all of the like core team member posting stuff was happening. It was like a month or more ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have Chip Noir here, who is basically in a back and forth with a deleted account. You can see here, right? Now, the reason we know that this is Dan Tsukasa, the deleted account, is because he links here to his Twitter at the time, trying to prove that he is who he says he is. To Chip Noir.
It says twitter.com/Dan Tsukasa.
You know what's weird?
It says right there, Dan
messages.
Tsukasa.
He just deleted his account, but he didn't delete his messages.
I thought deleting your account automatically deleted your messages, but
apparently not. You can delete messages if you cared that much. I don't know why he didn't.
Anyways, this thread, if you guys want to look into it, I mean, this is, again, where you can find it on the subreddit. This is the posting. Anyways, this is a back and forth where Chip Noir is sort of questioning whether or not he is credible in saying what he says he's saying. But he makes a couple of interesting claims. One, that Tetsuya Nomura has essentially been, he uses the word multiple times, banished. But that he's been pressured out, kind of the way that, say, Sakaguchi was around the year 2000 when the movie went bad and he left an executive position. That he's been sort of pressured out, been moved to Osaka, away from the Tokyo studio, and is essentially a director in name only on Kingdom Hearts 3 and the FF7 remake.
Well, director name only, I think, for FF7 remake. I think for Kingdom Hearts 3, he was saying that he is spending all his time doing that.
Legit on that. Okay.
Yeah. That's what all his time's going there. He's not actually very hands-on with the remake.
Oh, and then for some, I guess, background on this, Dan is claiming to have worked at Square Enix for about 4 months.
Back
a while ago. Yeah. Right. And so a lot of where he's coming from comes from, I think, speaking with people in the office during apparently those 4 months he was there.
Yeah.
So, again, we come down here. He makes that claim, but then as they're kind of going back and forth, Chip brought up that he was moved to Osaka to oversee the transition from the Luminous engine, which is what Kingdom Hearts was originally being developed on, to the Unreal 4 engine. And Dan argues back, no, that was never the case. They were always using Unreal Engine 4 on this game. And then basically Chip comes back and proves that's not the case. It was being developed by Luminous, and he's like, oh, you're right. Like, I was wrong about that. I made an assumption.
Which that just brings into question how many assumptions has he been making this whole time. Like, I personally believe that he is in the industry and he did at one point work there, and I take him at face value there. But I think he's taking a lot of liberties when he I worked there for 4 months 10 years ago. Here's my take on what's happening now. It's like he doesn't know anything anymore. It seems relative to what he may have known back then for those 4 months.
Yeah.
And he thinks he knows a lot, and he's making a lot of assumptions.
Yeah. The only reason I wanted to bring all this up is because of the fact that I think we should take what is being said here in the Power Up article with a grain of salt. It is possible that he has worked in the industry there in Japan, that he is living there, and that he does know some people. But it does not mean, especially given his voice of authority, the way he talks about things in the past and has been wrong about, that any of this is necessarily true. So his claim, again, for those who are kind of stepping into the live stream now, is that all of CyberConnect's work has been completely scrapped, that it was unusable, and that Square Enix started over
2 years on production,
and essentially started over when Square Enix brought it in-house, and that's why it's been behind and we haven't seen much. Right. I mean, there's part of that I could totally believe is true, regardless of this this guy and his reputation, because we haven't seen much. It's been a while, and
I think it's going to look pretty different too. Like, Cloud's being redesigned. That's a big enough change in of itself. But with the question as it's posed on the podcast, is the Final Fantasy VII Remake really in trouble? Yes, but not necessarily for the reasons Dan Tsukasa said.
Possibly not, and
possibly not.
In addition to that, I mean, maybe there will come out and show something at E3 this year, and maybe we will see that it's further along than we think.
Oh, Mike, you're giving everyone that hope again.
I don't believe it
dashed,
is,
man.
I don't believe that will be the case.
Yeah, I don't either.
But I am also not like really 100% on this other side of thinking that like it's doomed and that like the whole thing's a total train wreck mess. It could have been that CyberConnect's work wasn't really like moving in the direction or following the vision that the company wanted. Super Bunny Hop, who released his video on Project W last week, Kaysen was talking to him since Kaysen had made a Project W video in the past.
Yeah.
In that video, he makes a claim that when it was pitched, when the project was pitched to a board of the Japanese executives of Square, they were like, "Oh no, this is not at all what we want Final Fantasy to be." Right? Essentially, was the response to that. So any company being outsourced outside of Square Enix, bringing a Final Fantasy concept to them, I'm sure there's going to be a high level of what's the right word? They're going to be very careful, I think, about that. I think Final Fantasy is their flagship. They don't want the brand to go in a direction that they are not 100% on board with. So that could have been the case here with CyberConnect's version of Final Fantasy VII. They could have brought what they were working on, and it's just like, we don't agree with this vision of Final Fantasy VII. We're bringing it back in-house. That could have been all it was. I think to say this is completely unusable, one, might be a bit hyperbolic. It might be his just personal view or bias to CyberConnect's work. But on top of that, I think there is maybe something to be said there, because CyberConnect has mostly worked on mid-tier level games.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned in the video. I was surprised to hear that they were taking this on to begin with, that Square Enix was letting them make possibly the most important game that Square Enix will release in a decade, and they're letting this mid-tier company kind of work with it. Like, I can kind of see why things turned out the way they did.
Yeah.
And even if the work is 100% usable, they just want to take it in a different direction, they're still losing time by bringing all the assets in-house. Like project flow and who's working on what, and things. It takes a while for things to get up to speed when you're dealing with stuff like that. So they lost time. I don't know if it's 2 years though.
Yeah. Juan Soto, thank you very, very much for the donation. We appreciate it. Thanks for playing Grim Fandango last week. Dude, that game was fun. I really, really liked playing with you.
Those games are great.
Dude, really fun.
Quick adventures.
Yep. So the other thing I want to bring up too, regarding this whole sort of break, there were a lot of small news sites that picked up the story. Nothing on the major. And yeah, I was going to bring that up. This Game Rant article, which someone also sent to me earlier today, is claiming that Dan Tsukasa was the art director on Final Fantasy VII Remake.
That's the first article that I saw, was that one.
Yeah. And so...
really wrong.
I don't know. There's just a lot of things I feel that are suspect about the story in general. I think that anyone with common sense could say something went wrong with CyberConnect's version of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It got brought in-house, and they're probably making lots of changes.
Yeah.
But I think...
But you didn't need him to say that.
Yeah. I think Dan's
That's
voice...
just a safe assumption.
Dan's voice, the voice he uses in his scathing criticism of CyberConnect's work, makes it seem like this thing is freaking in shambles, and it's just like, oh, the whole thing is like a total train wreck mess.
Yeah, and that's also with his voice in the other Reddit thread that you're referencing when he talks about Nomura being banished. I think he just uses big words to affect, not like big as in complicated, but just big effect having words to for dramatic effect, I guess. Yeah, he uses hyperbole to get people to take him seriously or something, but like, Nomura wasn't banished. Okay, guys.
I heard he was beheaded.
There you go.
That's not hyperbole.
In Kyoto. at the Emperor's Palace.
Oh, geez, it's still legal to behead people there, right?
It's legal to hang people there. That's a whole other thing.
So, essentially, the reason why I want to discuss this as a topic today is to sort of just ground the whole thing a little bit more. Mm-hmm. There's probably certain aspects of what Dan's saying that are correct, and I think that anyone with common sense would know that, just based on the fact that CyberConnect was axed and they brought it in the house. Right, but I don't think we should take this as like the Final Fantasy VII Remake is in the same kind of development hell cycle that, say, Final Fantasy Versus 13-15 went through. And until...
Other than the fact that they are running up against that PS5, I consider that a deadline.
I do think there is... If the
PS5 is out before this game does, like, they have a big decision to make.
Yeah. And that wouldn't surprise me either, given...
And that
the fact
years
that they did that with Final Fantasy 15, right?
Yeah,
that it was a PS3. They don't want it to come at the end of the life cycle as much as they do onto the new platform.
They're doing online stuff. Like, they want to take advantage of the long tail, people playing this game years and years, and you don't do that at the end of a console's life.
Yeah. I would not be surprised if it came out on PlayStation 5. I would not be surprised at all.
And if it does, we're talking a very long time before we see this game.
But I don't think that it's in the mess that FF15 faced, and I don't think we should be that concerned necessarily.
One thing I think about is, like, even people who work in an industry are still fans of things.
Oh, sure.
Like, they still have that normal fan side to them. I feel like oftentimes even more so because they went to the great lengths of learning the trade and actually getting into the industry. So, like, we as consumers of these products, we have our own kind of gossip that we participate in, and we want to know who said what. But you better believe that inside the industry itself, with the people who actually know other people, they're talking about stuff. But that doesn't mean that they're any more authoritative when it comes to, like, knowing, like, an HR dispute. You know what I mean? Like, Square Enix is a gigantic company. I don't care if you work for Square Enix. I don't care if you work for them for several years. It's too big. You don't know everybody there. And so gossip could get around, but, like, that's just as good, really, as gossip that, like, a big Final Fantasy fan might have. You know what I mean? Because the organizations are too huge, and the secrecy is too big of a deal in the video game industry. So it's like the way he talks, it's just like, just because he works there doesn't mean
that he knows what he's talking about. He could
have just as bad of an opinion as any fan of anything arguing about a franchise.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
He also said something else in that Reddit thread. He said, lots of it's hard to find a game developer here who doesn't know someone that works for Square Enix, right? Because Square Enix is such a big company.
A lot of people freelance and
they all kind of contribute. And Square Enix, and then you just have friends that you went to video game design school with or whatever, right? And some of them went to work for Square Enix. And, like, what Dan Scasa's thing was, like, if you don't believe me, well, like, everyone out here knows someone. But it's like, but no one else is saying what he's saying. There aren't leaks happening. And, like, how, according to what he said, this information is just out there and all the video game people know it. How come this is the first time we're hearing about it?
Yeah. Yeah, and on top of that, again, I mean, the source that a lot of these websites that were covering the story, they're just sourcing Reddit, his comments on Reddit or whatever. So you haven't seen the story picked up.
With his Twitter and his ArtStation, it did seem like he was in the industry, but
yeah, but I don't know. I just feel like it's telling that you don't see Kotaku or IGN or Destructoid or any other of the larger.
They used to
picking the story up,
which was almost as bad.
True.
But NeoGaf's gone now, so Reddit's all that we have.
In any case, it is interesting to talk about, contemplate, but we still really just don't know what's going on. And we'll have to wait to hear more news to know. So, that being said, let's move on to our next topic here. This is from Jared Fight on Patreon. How do you balance the classic feel of old JRPGs and still bring forward innovations in gameplay? So I think there have been some good examples of this. I think when you're talking about AAA console titles, generally speaking, publishers, developers are a lot less likely to take a lot of chances. They like to play it a little bit safe with the huge costs.
Yeah.
But you look at games on a little bit lower of the budget scale, like Bravely Default. I think Bravely Default's a great answer to this question, because it took the classic JRPG turn-based sort of battle system, menu commands, but brought in the entire, the Brave system where you can take a risk and give yourself multiple turns or multiple attacks or whatever in a turn, but then leave yourself defenseless for a long time. Or you can sort of like hang back and collect lots of turns to unleash later and be a little bit more defensive.
Seems like Project Octopath is doing a variant on that.
Yeah, same. Well, actually, it's not the same studio. I used to think it was. It's actually a different studio. But yeah, a similar idea that Octopath Traveler is doing there. I would say another example of like a modern... Persona, I think, does this really well just with like even just the UI design side of things. Like, it takes a classic idea, but just makes it look really cool and modern and exciting, and does a lot, I think, to... I don't know, because a lot of people, a lot of industry people would argue that classic turn-based battle systems, like that's not, it's not like with Final Fantasy going more action-based, right? Obviously, they're trying to be more exciting in sort of like the presentation of the battle mechanics, the battle design, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But obviously, Persona has shown us that like lots and lots of people are still interested in turn-based combat and strategy. So. Yeah, I mean, I think that just iterating on past ideas, I mean, a lot of games, you go back even to the PlayStation 1, there were a lot of really interesting ideas being worked with that sort of like Chrono Cross, for instance, really stands out. It is not like basically any other turn-based RPG from its era. I could sit here and explain the battle system. I won't. For those who have played it, you'll know what I'm talking about. There are so many ways that you can mix up a formula and keep it turn-based and still make it exciting. So my answer to that would be Bravely Default, Chrono Cross, maybe even Trails of like Cold Steel or something like that. Persona. They've all shown us that this can be done.
I see that for sure in Trails.
Yeah, all of those have shown us that I think you can continue to make iterations, changes, add new ideas to the concept, but still make it what it was, like not change genres, but keep it as a turn-based thing, and that it can still be exciting.
Yeah, I feel like we got Nix Lycos.
Oh, awesome!
Smiley face. Thank you for the smile, Nix.
Thank you, Nix. Really appreciate it, man.
I feel like when you look at like how groups of objects interact, like if you have two objects, they can interact with each other, and that's pretty simple. You have three like concepts, let's say, they all have their own relationship to each other. And as you add, maybe you get up to the number 4, all of a sudden, like you actually have this exponential growth in the number of connections that you have with each individual unit that you add. So whether that be groups of people or whatever. And I think in video games, if you come up with a gameplay mechanic that interacts with all of your other mechanics in some fashion, that you've just multiplied exponentially the potential in your game, the potential outcomes and things that people experiment with and do. And so I think that there's like what you're talking about, Mike, like with Bravely Default, or even what Persona does. Like for me, Persona 5 with the gun, just throwing the gun in there, made it a lot more interesting, because you've got a little bit more choice to make, but not an overwhelming number of choices to make. And it just, I feel like the turn-based formula works really well when you've got your +1. You know what I mean? You've got your like, what's your twist? And to me, like that's almost all you need, because a lot of, especially in JRPGs, a lot of that formula, and I'm not using formula in a negative way. It's just the structure of things has been fine-tuned over the years. And so we've seen things that did and didn't work. And if you can take what did work and then just throw your twist into that, I think you can find some level of success. Like Octopath, it's essentially still just a turn-based RPG, but you throw that little bit of a twist in with how like limit type stuff works, or how you can save up tax or whatever. and that makes it like more interesting than it sounds explaining it. You know what I mean? Just saying, oh, you can do this, or you could do this, and that sounds like, oh yeah, sure, whatever. But in practice, it's like, oh yeah, man, like I feel like I have more control, or I don't, it's a little more unpredictable. And to me, that's kind of like, and that might sound like cheap and again, like formulaic, but I do think it works. And I think that you can lose things when you try and change too much. But if you try and kind of push things forward just enough, there's a lot of crap that like was never done in the 90s that could have been done that is still on the table. It's real easy to talk about it like, oh, they did everything back in the day and they figured it out. Yeah. It was like, no, I mean, there's only like, there are a lot of RPGs that came to the West, more in Japan, but still when you add them up, it's like the ones that people talk about, the ones that were good, it's like, that's not that many games. Like there's a lot of uncharted territory, I guess you could say, from that era. But but it's true. If you're just doing what's that company that makes like a bunch of smartphone RPGs? They make like a new one every like 3 months.
Oh yeah, I used to know what they're called.
Crap, they're all like RPG Maker style.
Yeah.
Oh dang it.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Search for RPGs on the App Store, which I'm just gonna do. But
Zanesoft.
Oh yeah. Anyways, this is like a Chinese company, and they make so many games, and it's the same every time. And I think that's what people.
And
are
the thumbnails look almost the same.
Gosh, I can't find it right, but like, there's definitely a way you can screw it up. Storyline wise too, I think people like RPGs. They want to see an interesting, unique story, and sometimes, the mechanics could be great, but the story could be just stale or a typical anime storyline, I guess you could say. The sort of stuff that you see a lot of. Don't want to piss anybody off, but there's specific anime that are just basically the same thing over and over. So yeah, it's always nice to have one thing that's unpredictable. I feel like, anyways.
One of the questions would be whether or not to bring the innovations in the greater RPG world into something like Final Fantasy, which has been doing things a certain way for a while, at least up until 12, 11-ish, I guess. And all of a sudden that became a series of innovations where now you don't know what to expect in the next iteration of the game. Whereas up until that point, you did know what to expect.
Kimco. It is Kimco.
That's the company
that makes all those RPGs.
Kimco.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. Elusia says Kimco here.
But so my point is, like, when you're innovating, the like who is doing the innovating is typically the smaller companies, not really the bigger ones.
Yep. You get too big, you can't take risks, too much money, too bloated, too big.
Square Enix has been doing that. Final Fantasy has been, but it's not as risky. They're just adopting what other people take the risk that works, and then Square Enix says, okay, let's make Final Fantasy that. Right. And I think that's kind of a dangerous place to be, because a lot of games end up being the same. And so kind of like you mentioned the PS1, there are all these different types going out. But if you look at like Vagrant Story to Final Fantasy Tactics to Final Fantasy 7 or 8 or whatever, and you mentioned Xenogears as well, and you've got pretty different battle systems amongst all of them, right?
Yeah.
But one of them won out, I guess. It was Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 kind of like won, so to speak, where it just sold better, and then everyone abandoned all of those other kinds of games. The tactical RPGs it's not a common genre anymore. Stuff like Vagrant Story, where you kind of select like what.
I've not seen something like Vagrant Story in any other game.
Fallout kind of does that, but
that's true. That's true.
But it's not common anymore. And then same thing with, I guess with like, anyways, the games. Once something wins, everyone does it, but that sucks and that's stupid, because then you miss out on all the potential innovations for the other things that were working well. They just didn't sell 10 million copies like Final Fantasy 7, but they're still really, really solid. It might even work better today, but nowadays it's all about the action RPGs. So we're always talking about bringing back the old JRPG system, but even within that system, it's like, no, that there's still other stuff, even when that system rose to prominence, that we could still pick from. There is plenty innovative. You don't need to do anything new today. You can just take essentially what's already been done and put a little modern twist.
Actually, a good example of that is how many successful platformers have there been, indie platformers, in the past couple of years. I think there have been quite a few. And that was a genre that people were like, "Oh, that's just everyone's bored of that."
Yeah, like 12 years ago, there were
like Celeste is kind of the new hot one right now. Yeah,
Celeste, Owlboy, Super Meat Boy was kind of at the forefront of like the platform research.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely think to answer the question that there's a lot of ways to go about it, and I think a lot of it's been done already. It's just a matter of whether a AAA studio be willing to sort of like go back to that. As of now, it seems that they're kind of moving away from it, which is unfortunate. We got Atlas though. Atlas brings us great RPGs, so
yeah, they do good.
Okay, let's move on to Darius here, who asks the next question. This might be beating a dead horse. I was reading this Swedish book on video game collecting, and the author claims that objectively, games released in the 90s were better. I can't even finish the sentence without laughing. Better than the ones in the next decade, the 2000s. The author makes the case that in the late 90s there was enormous hype and focus on what the future might bring, especially in contemporary gaming magazines of the era. At the time, we had experienced enormous jumps in quality since the 80s. Compare FF1 in 1987 to FF7 in 1997, or Super Mario Bros. 1985 to Super Mario 64 in 1996. The author's conclusion being that ultimately the 2000s ended up disappointing us in terms of quality. Not me. I don't know what this guy's talking about. If we limit our scope to RPGs, what are your thoughts looking back? Now that we've had time to distance ourselves from the previous decade, the 2000s.
This guy sounds like he was probably 20 in the 80s.
Yeah.
40, and he's like, F all this stuff.
Anyone who is trying to make the case that games of a certain era were objectively better than another era, I have got to see the line of reasoning that comes to that conclusion, because, I mean, obviously he's not going to supply that here in the comment. You'd have to read the book or whatever, but that's an impossible claim to make.
Games in the 80s are better than games in the 40s. I'm willing.
They were. That is that's a pretty good objective statement. Video games in the 80s were better than video games in the 1940s.
Yes. Sure.
Sure. I can follow. The 1990s had some incredible games. We all were 90s kids, so we can understand, right? Only 90s kids can understand how good video games were in the 90s. However, I mean, just last year I played Hellblade, which was one of the fetching best games I've ever played in my entire life. I played games during the 2000s that are some of my favorites. Wind Waker is one of those right off the bat. One of the best games of all time. Yeah. There's tons of games from the 2000s. The Prince of Persia games, which are some of my favorites of all time, came out then. A ton of games on the GameCube, PS2 era. Shadow of the Colossus. Like, you kidding me? Like, this guy's going to claim that... I don't know. I think it's a crazy claim. Yeah. I don't buy it at all. Like, there have been classics, just pillars of excellence through every single era, every single decade since the gaming industry has existed. I can't buy into what that guy's saying at all. I think it's a bogus claim.
But also he's a collector, I guess. So he's like, usually collectors that collect, because it sounds like he maybe is specifically collecting older games. Usually if you're collecting something like that, you're like so into it. You're so hyper focused on it that you just
objective reality.
You're in your own bubble, I guess.
Yeah. So pretty quick answer to the question. There's not really much to go on because the guy cannot possibly be making an objective claim.
Because the premise, it's a faulty premise to begin with. It's impossible to answer a question that is premised with something that's
such a fallacious premise.
Not correct. Yeah.
Just Darius, sorry we couldn't go more in depth.
I personally like the 90s better than the following 10 years, but
okay, so the 2000s saw the emergence of a genre that essentially didn't exist in the 90s, and that's the shooter FPS.
The first person,
I mean, it existed. Obviously, you have
Chex
Doom,
Quest.
You have Chex Quest,
FPS,
you have Quake and stuff that started building steam in the 90s. Those were pretty niche. Yeah, but the 90s
up until Halo,
exactly.
Yeah,
Halo, the Call of Duty stuff. you really start to see that blow up in the 2000s. And if you ever look at a chart,
those are probably the best selling games of the 2000s.
Probably are. If you ever look at a chart of like video game genres by year, there's a year when like the FPS basically really starts to explode, and I believe it's probably 2001 after Halo. And it starts eating into, you know, essentially like everything. This is assuming zero sum, but it appears to essentially eat into a few genres in particular. One of those being RPGs that shooters got really popular. So if you're a guy who freaking is pissed that FPS games exist at all. I could see
that's the era in which
freak, man. It's ruined the whole thing, and everyone made the FPS games after this.
And that's funny though, because those were good games. Because I played Halo and Call of Duty, and in that era, in 08, 09 specifically, and for Call of Duty, and I liked it. I played that. I didn't play any game more than Call of Duty World at War the whole year of 2009, basically, and that's the game I played more than any other game. So it's like, yeah, sure, you can look at it that way, but at the same time, those games were really fun when that genre was really going.
I
don't play them anymore, but
they didn't take away from the other stuff though that was still being done. So
nope.
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna put.
Which year is objectively better, 2016 or 2017?
Which one was what was the year where all those celebrities died? Was that 2016?
Oh, 16, I think.
That everyone was like freaking out, like all the celebs that were like dying in 2016. Everyone's like freaking out about it.
No, it was 17. It was
last year
because Donald Trump got elected in 16, and then in 2017 the joke was, "Oh, Trump's president, everyone's piecing out." Was that it, or maybe that was just while he was running?
I don't know.
In any case, there's no answer.
There is no answer.
Objectively better. I mean, I could pick
17 probably have games, but still.
I could probably pick a handful of games from every decade that I would place as worthy of consideration for like a top 10 list. Mass Effect, Dark Souls from like the PS3 generation. I would pick games like Hellblade from this generation. I would pick, like I said, Shadow of the Colossus or Wind Waker from GameCube, or Prince of Persia, even Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, the first one that is. I mean, all these games were just like freaking incredible. So I would put them on the same level as anything I played in the 90s.
It's hard to make an objective statement about a subjective medium. So.
Yeah, no objective statement can be made there. I'm sorry, guy has faulty premise.
And I predict that the dude was 20 in the 80s and 30 in the 90s. I guarantee you.
You may be right.
Okay, let's move on to our next question here. This one comes from Xylon73. So there's more. He wrote a lot more on Patreon when he posted the question. I shortened it for our use here. But he's referring to the main characters from Tales of Vesperia. Essentially, the idea is that they're both trying to fight corruption. One goes about it with more of like a lawful good sort of like viewpoint, right? And another one goes about it in a more chaotic, violent way. But they both have the same goal. They're approaching it from different ways, and they meet lots of times throughout the game. They clash and they fight and they, criticize one another. Heavy words. But the idea is that I think at least what he said in that game is that the character you actually play as is the one who's the more chaotic side. So as earlier when I was starting the podcast, I mentioned how this is sort of maybe a parallel to Delita and Ramza in Final Fantasy Tactics. The difference being that in Tactics you played as the lawful good character, Ramza, and his approach to how we deal with corruption versus Delita, which was more of like the violent approach. In Tales of Vesperia, it's flipped. So you play as the more chaotic, violent guy and do not play as the guy who's more of the, the lawful, moral side. So with that in mind, I believe what he was asking in the question of saying, how should characters be written, is that he's trying to say that these characters are written in such a way that they are more, this is my paraphrasing or my interpretation of what he asked, but I think it's right, is that the characters themselves are tools for the theme rather than being written necessarily in a realistic way, like where you develop the person as an individual. It's like they are written to basically service this theme or this clash of ideals versus like writing the individual in a more nuanced way. I think that's what he was getting at. So what I mean is these two characters were written to coexist, to fight, to clash. So should this approach be adopted generally, or would you rather see characters written focusing on the self first and then moving to interactions? If I am completely wrong in interpreting that question, Xylon, I am very sorry. You can correct me either in the comments here or on Patreon or whatever. But my answer is that I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. I think that a good writer has something that they want to say with the story that they're trying to tell. And characters can very well be used as tools to express what it is that they're trying to say with the piece. Yes, you can run into issues where maybe there's a trope being used or the character's fitting an archetype or whatever. But it all comes down to the execution. That can still be executed in a really good way to where the focus is not about like getting super personal and building like a realistic character as much as it is putting these characters in situations where we can talk about or explore the ideals and make a case for one or the other, which one you feel is right, or whether you want to leave that in the hands of the audience, whatever it is. You can still write a really good story with character archetypes, I think, as long as it's executed the right way. But it really just depends on the purpose of the work. It depends on the purpose of why the author is writing this. And yeah, generally speaking, I think as a general rule, you'd want to try and make characters not fit archetypes because people recognize those and it feels cheap to the audience. Maybe they'll say, oh, I've seen this character before. So generally speaking, you'd like to write a more nuanced character, but that doesn't mean it can't be done well when you fit characters into archetypes and use them as tools for a theme.
I would actually maybe argue a little bit the opposite direction of that. Archetypes are archetypes for a reason. They're kind of cross-culture, and like the hero's journey isn't unique just to the English-speaking Americans, but it also, is resonant. I think that's what essentially an archetype is a resonant story that people can kind of identify with, because not only because they hear it so often, but because it just kind of fits into the way the human brain works. So I think breaking archetypes is important, and it's probably where some of the more artistic stories are. But archetypes are the resonant, familiar stories that humans have been telling for millions of years, right? And I think that, I just kind of wanted to throw that out there.
Sure, I actually agree with you. I think that's very true.
But breaking them is when artistically you can introduce people to new stuff, which is important.
It's weird in the age that we live in, like the amount of media people can consume is too dang high. Right? It's too dang high. You can so like I used to love TV tropes as a website, right? I would just go on there and just read. Like, oh, sick. What's another trope? Like, I would just want to read it and see all the examples everywhere. But after a while, and I'm talking like years later, after a really long while, I started realizing that TV tropes is essentially like, it's a gigantic, massive, massive website, just categorizing everything that can be categorized. And there's some people that I feel like are very sensitive to tropes because they consume a large amount of a particular type of media.
Or sometimes they're like stereotypical in certain ways.
Sure, yeah. I say this mostly because I want to attack anime fans. No, but it is a lot of TV tropes. There's a lot of anime stuff on TV tropes, and because there's a lot of tropes in anime, because there's a lot of anime and a lot of anime that's made really quickly. So
that's very true.
They just crank stuff out. And like the thing with anime is you can find like a subgenre, like a really specific subgenre that you like, and there's a lot of stuff to watch. And so like you become a fan of a thing and it's predictable and comfortable, and then so like that almost is the attraction in some ways. You know, is that somebody can come home from work and then watch their slice of life with maids in it or whatever, you know, and like that's that's what
they're into.
Yeah, that's their thing. And so like this may be a little tangential, but I feel like just because like something can be categorized into a trope, I feel like everything has been categorized into a trope at this point. And so in some ways it's like, it's a fun exercise to like be like, oh, this is similar, and it's a really useful tool, I think, for comparing and contrasting. But you know, I just feel like almost everything's been covered. And if you want to approach media in this way, or you want to create media in this way, like there's pros and cons to that. Obviously, if you want to make things really quickly, it can be really useful. Just go on like, what are the tropes? What do people expect? Okay, bam, we'll just do all those things. But at the same time, like, I don't think that in and of itself delegitimizes something, because humans are dying and being born all the time. So we're repeating the same stories.
There's always a new generation.
Exactly. There's new groups of teenagers and stuff that I remember like watching. I think this is an example, like Trigun, I guess, as a teenager.
Sure.
Like, whoa. And like the end of Trigun being like, that's the most original, mind-blowing, innovative thing I've ever heard in my entire life, because it was. At the time. And then you get farther into it and you start realizing like, this is a very common repeated thing.
Right.
I remember, I think I brought this up before, but I remember watching you play Xenoblade Chronicles, Mike, and I remember like seeing, you know, a particular scene and being like, what the fetch? That is exactly the same thing. And just being like, it was almost exactly the same thing. And it was a little, not like disappointing because it was still done well, but it's a little bit like, oh, and like, I think as you get older, you can get jaded. So like, it's tough to like, I don't know. So I'm not saying people can't do this crap like poorly. Like, obviously a lot of people do it really, really poorly. And oftentimes because they don't put the time required into something. But there's some surprisingly simple and straightforward concepts that excel on a high level just because of execution. So like, people can have a great idea, but if you don't execute, it doesn't matter. Like, I think an example of this, what came to my mind at first with this was like Batman and the Joker, right? It's like they represent these polar opposites and these philosophies, and all of like the Batman and Joker storylines revolve around that concept. The Dark Knight executed that really, really well. But if every single Batman movie was that, I would be like, okay, it's the reason why there's more villains than just the Joker,
and
right?
Each one has a very different attitude. And
exactly. If you're gonna write in that style, which I guess would be similar to this whole like they're almost, the characters are plot devices in and of themselves, then like you're gonna need to expand the cast. So like in Batman, because of the psychological themes, I remember watching that behind the scenes of The Dark Knight, and they're talking about how all these characters represent different kind of psychosis and stuff.
Yep.
And that's cool. That's so cool to explore. And that's a tool to explore that maybe you couldn't necessarily do outside of that, like writing style. You know what I mean? Like, who's going to represent this and who's going to, so you end up with a lot of characters that maybe aren't as three-dimensional as they could be, but you can explore some themes in a way that people maybe you can go deep in ways that you don't lose people. Potentially, because people already know what Batman represents, and then so Batman doesn't like this guy because this guy represents this other thing, and you can go hit these kind of themes that way. So it's kind of a tangential way to kind of say that, like, I feel like it's a tool, like archetypes or tropes or these kinds of characters are tools in and of themselves.
And then setting up something but breaking that trope is another tool.
That's
like
true.
You pick,
so people are like, oh, this is the bad guy for sure.
And then it's like, psych, and now everyone does that.
Wow.
And it gets
and then that's a trope in and of itself.
Okay, yeah. The bait and switch trope. But then you can bait and switch and then re-switch, and then you were right, but you didn't realize it. And you could just kind of keep carrying that over and over and over as much as you want. That was
kind of what Death Note got to for me. After like the first season of Death Note was so sick, and then I think it was the second season, because we're only 2 seasons, right?
Yeah, 2 seasons.
The second season was where it was like,
it was a different character than L.
That's a good example of this. That's an example of this.
Yeah, it is actually.
Yeah.
Because they're like
light and L. the dichotomy between the two characters. Yeah.
But given, if Death Note is one of your early exposures to that type of content, it's awesome. It's phenomenal. It's really well done. But if you've seen it before and over before, it might not have that impact that you'd be hoping for.
Yeah,
sure. That's true. I remember when I played Xenogears, and I was doing all my research for the review and stuff like that. Reading about how, I mean, it's not even like, it's not even renamed. I mean, the references to Soylent Green and Childhood's End are just like straight up, just like lifted from here. Like the Soylent system in Xenogears is just straight up like homage to Soylent Green. Wow. And the name of one of the villains, which is Corellian in the localization, but that's a mistranslation. It should be Corellin, is directly Corellin from Childhood's End. I mean, it's like just like absolutely, just totally easy to see what the references were, what the inspirations were. Didn't even try to like twist it into something that felt. And I think that goes along with what you guys are saying. Like, I grew up in an age where if I had played Xenogears when I was a kid, that would have been my first exposure to those ideas being explored in Xenogears. But they had been explored before. Star Wars is the same way. I grew up with Star Wars. I didn't grow up with the stuff that inspired, Flash Gordon, the stuff that inspired Star Wars directly. I mean, just like so easy to see. That was like completely lifted and ripped out and just placed here. I mean, a lot of tropes we don't even realize are tropes because we weren't there for the version that came before our generation or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, I mean, characters absolutely can be used as tools, archetypal characters, to explore the theme or the idea or whatever. And I think that can be executed very well. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way to go about writing a character. All depends on the purpose of what you're doing.
As far as this focusing on self first and then moving to interactions, that is difficult to do unless you have like a narrator or unless you're reading the character's mind, right? The way you get to know a main character, if you're going about it like third person, not omniscient, you are basically through their interactions is how you get to know what kind of person they are, how they treat other people, who they are in general, and then you get to see enough interactions to know, they're different when they're with this person or they're different when they're alone. However you can figure that out. But I don't like it when games let you basically read people's minds and thoughts. Like I think the Tales of games sometimes, is that right? They sometimes, gosh, there might be a better example. It's like in brackets, and it's like
I think
the person's basically thinking out loud. But you're reading it and you know what they're thinking, and it's like, okay, that's fine. That's one way to do it. But I'd prefer it to be, I don't want to be reading the character's mind necessarily. And sometimes it's fine. I'm sure there's games where I've had to do that where it's been wonderful. But typically I'd say the interactions should come first. That's how you should introduce your character, and that's how you should get to know a character, as opposed to them just telling you.
Well, that's because,
or even showing you.
That's how you get to know people in real life, right? Exactly. I can't read anyone else's mind. I get to know somebody through their actions.
Exactly.
Through my interactions with them. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, unless you are placing the player right into the role directly of the player character or something, as in like a legit role-playing game,
Right.
Like, if you want to get to know a character over time, it makes a lot more sense intuitively to get to know them through how they act and what they say and things like that. I agree with that. All right. Thank you for that question, Xylon73. Good question. Let's move on to Brian Gillis. In a cosmic catastrophe, the Final Fantasy series is wiped from existence in the minds of everyone but you, and the world is otherwise unchanged. To educate people on the importance of it to the history of JRPGs, you have to compile together other games into a series representative of what Final Fantasy was to help illustrate the steps it made along the way and how it evolved and influenced gaming. What games do you pick to make up this replacement series, and why? This is a very tough question, but a good one.
I've got a couple, and it's kind of cheating, but I've got it. So you got Secret of Mana, you've got Mario RPG, and you've got Chrono Trigger. I would say that Mario RPG has Final Fantasy references in it, right? And it was made by Square Enix. And then Secret of Mana arguably like almost was a Final Fantasy game as it was being developed, right? And then same thing with Chrono Trigger, where it was like, in the early stages, clearly these works are heavily based off of Final Fantasy. But I don't think this questioner, Ryan, wanted us to bring up games that were influenced by Final Fantasy to then re-influence back into Final Fantasy and be like, oh, that's how this game is. But those are, in my opinion, the closest.
Yeah. I would say like NES era, it's most closely like tied to, say, Dragon Quest.
Dragon Quest, yeah. See, all these Square Enix games.
Dragon Warrior.
Well, that was Enix,
That's true. That was Enix,
they were
not
separate.
Square. That's
so
the point.
Dragon Quest, I think, best represents. It's still not perfect, but is the best equivalent to what Final Fantasy on the NES was, or Famicom. Yeah. Moving into the Super Nintendo era, Chrono Trigger is literally the closest thing to Final Fantasy. The only game I can think of that's basically Final Fantasy is freaking Chrono Trigger.
Right.
Just with the Dragon Quest art style slapped on top of it. So yeah, Chrono Trigger. I think Secret of Mana is a good one too.
Yeah. If you get into PS1, we've got like Legend of Dragoon. We've got a long list of games that are Final Fantasy VII inspired.
Xenogears is a pretty good one, but not necessarily from gameplay, more from storytelling and just like the way stories started to become structured on the PS1 era of Final Fantasy games. Mm-hmm. They got way more complicated. But again, Xenogears is sort of was birthed by that process itself. I mean, it was like because of Final Fantasy, that it kind of was what it was too. Same with Chrono Cross. Moving into the PS2 era,
it gets harder. I'm realizing it gets harder.
It gets a lot harder. It's a lot harder.
First off, Final Fantasy 10, 11, and 12 are drastically different games, including gameplay and everything, right? But Knights of the Old Republic is similar in battle system to Final Fantasy 12.
Some people here are saying Suikoden and Star Ocean.
Oh, Star Ocean.
Arcadia, Lufia 2. It really is. I think you brought up a really good point, though. A lot of these other games were inspired by Final Fantasy.
Absolutely.
So the similarities 90%. There exist because Final Fantasy. So it's kind of hard to say that the world is otherwise unchanged. Just Final Fantasy's been removed because how many games were influenced by Final Fantasy? It's like freaking
basically the whole genre. I don't know that you could come up with any RPG that wasn't influenced by Final Fantasy.
So it becomes tough, but like Rogue Galaxy, I think could say is pretty similar to 12.
Yeah, for sure. Chips and everything.
So that might be one I'd pick for 12. I can't really compare the MMOs to any other MMOs because I don't play any freaking MMOs.
Oh, Quest 64. We
How do we draw a comparison?
That one up.
I really can't think of anything to represent FF13 because I've never played a game like FF13. I don't think FF13 did much to influence or inspire how RPGs were made.
I don't think so. It's kind of the only of its kind, except for phone games. I've noticed a lot of the phone game RPG systems are seem to be similar to Final Fantasy 13, which is disappointing to say out loud.
Sandberry says that 14 is just World of Warcraft with an FF skin.
There you go, World of Warcraft.
Bravely Default is a good one to bring up. I think Bravely Default does that Bravely Default's basically a Final Fantasy game as well. Mm-hmm. Lost Odyssey is there we go. Lost Odyssey for sure. Would be a good comparison to FF10.
Man.
I think FF10 and Lost Odyssey are very similar in the way they're sort of made. Not like combat mechanics necessarily, but like the pre-rendered backgrounds and the characters sort of running through them at fixed camera angles. It feels very similar, Lost Odyssey does, to like kind of the way FF10, FF10-2 are sort of structured navigation-wise.
Forgot to bring up Last Story.
The Last Story... Well, that's a more action-oriented game, so that maybe that could be compared to kind of the direction 15 went.
15. Kingdom Hearts.
Radiant like, Historia is good. Kingdom Hearts is directly inspired by it. Radiant Historia is another good one to bring up, though. So yeah, I mean, all good picks. People have lots of good picks here in the comments.
What's the closest game to Final Fantasy 15? Grand Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto.
That'd be a bad Grand Theft Auto name.
You go help people instead of,
and just drive on.
And you can't drive off the
road. Anyways, those are some thoughts. Some games you could use to help describe what Final Fantasy was to someone who's never played Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
Didn't know what it is.
They still don't know.
Well, I was on a podcast on Sunday with a group called The Last Honest Gamers. You can look them up on YouTube. A lot of them had not. Well, some of them had played more Final Fantasy games, but I think there was. I think it was Maddie in particular had only played Final Fantasy 15 before. She hadn't actually played.
Oh, whoa! What a one
the other Final Fantasy games. So it's like, how would I describe what Final Fantasy 7 is like to someone who maybe had played other RPGs of that era but had not played Final Fantasy 7? You know what I mean? They're like, well, it's kind of like Xenogears, but it's kind of like this.
Like Gears of Cerberus, except you follow a side character named Cloud.
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
So yeah, I mean, nice thought experiment for sure. Thank you, Brian, for the question. Let's move on to our last one here. This one comes from Christopher Guin. What's the hardest you've ever laughed when playing a JRPG? I have one almost immediately. You remember when we were streaming The Legend of Dragoon, and we came up to this door, and the door is locked, and the character says, "God, it's locked." And we just all like freaking
so
lost it. Because it was meant to just be like a mildly annoying, like, it's locked, crap, like I can't get in this door. But with including it's just like the dude was like so pissed, that he could not unlock the door. If you guys look up, just go into our channel and search Legend of Dragoon. You should come up to the stream. We were infiltrating some kind of castle. It's like maybe halfway through, maybe a little before halfway through. But we all saw that line. It just like erupted in laughter because it was just very awkward translation there.
Yeah. Those 90s translations were objectively better than decade after. Throw that out there.
Yeah, so I think maybe the next best example for me, I was playing Radiata Stories. And in Radiata Stories, the main character is like a real, like, he kind of just does what he wants. He's like a little bit of a rebel personality. He's a little bit rambunctious, not one to follow orders without questioning, that sort of thing. He's a young kid, you know. The game's very funny in general, very witty the way it's written. But they built a game mechanic into it where basically the way you check things, is he kicks it. So like you can run up to like a desk and you kick it and like something will pop out of it. You can run up to characters and kick them and they'll like get pissed at you. And if you kick them enough times, they'll actually like fight you. They'll like get into a battle. So like the whole game is you just run around just like kicking stuff. And then on top of that, it has, the gradient for a lot of games where you go from walking to running. It's like a gradient on the control stick. His gradient goes from like a walk to like this power walk, this really funny like power walking around into a run. I don't know. There's just a lot of attention to detail with how you navigate and explore the world that like exudes the character's personality. And so Roddy Out of Stories, I was cracking up all the time. So that's probably be my next example. But
I have an example from when I was like a lot younger. So I was maybe 10 or so. We played Mario RPG, and I was really young, and I don't know. I've come across this multiple times, and I don't laugh as much now. But I'm pretty sure, from what I remember, I laughed extremely hard. I don't know. It's been a long time. But you're playing the game. You go to the Mushroom Kingdom, and somebody's like, what's his name? The purple dinosaur.
Oh.
The purple dinosaur. What's his name?
Like Birdo?
Yeah. Well, no. He steals Mallow's coin, and he makes off.
The crocodile.
I remember his name. This guy steals Mallow's coin and runs off, right? And then we talk to him. Oh, my coin. He's all mad. So then we go and talk to Toad, and we get to ask him, like, why didn't you stop him, basically? And his response is, because I left my bazooka at home. Sheesh, give me a break. And I think it's because the way the game was set up to that point, that was just very left field. It was very much like a call to what is modern based on what the game to that point had been in itself. It hadn't, like, pulled me out of it, except for at that point for comedic effect. It was really funny. Like, I thought that was probably the funniest line for years in any game I've ever. That was wonderful.
Jeff Brown, Bowser's Inside Story is probably one of the funniest games I've played, but I don't have an example of a specific moment. It's mostly Bowser.
I did erupt, I think, in out loud laughter when I was playing the first Mario and Luigi RPG when they just started speaking gibberish Italian. Yeah. I thought that was hilarious, dude. It's like so funny.
And they don't.
Oh crap! We're losing.
Every structure you play as Bowser so much that you don't get as much of that Italian. So I missed that a lot in that game.
Jack Pateas here. Roddy Out of Stories for the win. Jack is the champion of the evangelist of Roddy Out of Stories. What's up, Jack? Okay. Anything else you guys have thoughts on with artists you've ever laughed at JRPG?
No. The JRPGs that have lines, though, as long as it's fitting, or if it's not fitting, it better be freaking really funny. Those tend to be some of the more memorable ones, though. Like Final Fantasy 7, it's a very serious game, but the comedic parts of that game are quite funny and are almost make the game more charming and memorable than everything else. Obviously it makes it more charming than everybody dying, but it helps add to the game's legacy. I think that it wasn't just as serious as I think people remember it, partly because of things like Advent Children, Dirge of Cerberus, and so on.
All right. Well, everybody, that's the end of our podcast. If anyone has a rapid fire question you'd like us to answer real quick before we take off,
do it now.
Fire
it can't
away.
be the Final Fantasy 13-2 review.
And if there's one misspelled word, we're not reading it.
We're not. You gotta have enough signatures.
Okay, we're gonna let people catch up. It'll take about 20 seconds, 25 seconds.
That Final Fantasy 6 sucks. I saw that in the chat and was not happy to see it.
That's not a good take.
No, that's a bad take. I almost banned them, but I just couldn't get there fast enough.
How can it suck? 90s.
I know, the 90s was objectively better, people.
The
90s were objectively better. You obviously weren't there for that conversation.
When's the next hangout?
Also, towards the middle of the 90s.
The next hangout, like local hangout.
I don't know.
I have no idea. Maybe next year sometime. Beastmas is coming up though. Beastmas is in August, so you've got that to look forward to.
Yeah. Is it necessary to remake Final Fantasy 7? Probably not.
Not necessary.
Probably not, but it's fun,
Well, we see FF7 on PS4 or PS5, the remake.
My money would be on 5 based on what I can tell and based on it being Square Enix.
It will be PS4 and PS5.
Ooh,
I actually think it'll be dual. I think it'll come out on both. That's my pick.
I'm not doing it, guys. I'm sticking with 5. Too many issues.
Would you want a Chrono Trigger 3D remake? No. Totally happy, especially with how they did Legend of Mana or Secret of Mana recently.
Dude, but there was that fan, the 3D, like the N64 graphic.
I do remember that. That did look pretty cool.
Yeah, that was kind of cool.
That did look pretty cool. But no, I'd rather they just leave that game alone. Make a new Chrono game of some kind.
Yeah.
Leave Chrono Trigger
Below Gaming, or they talk about if Tifa's design will be changed. I haven't seen much of Tifa yet in the remake, so.
Why don't you Advent Children?
I just assumed they'd use the model from Advent Children, honestly.
Do you guys think Tifa will get a redesign? Sure, to some degree.
Maybe.
But having said that, I know recently Nomura was saying something about the current redesign of Cloud that we've not seen yet. The character model has been redesigned. That they've made him look the closest to the original purple guy from the FF7 original game than any iteration we've seen since then.
Is that good or bad?
Well, it makes me think that they possibly are concerned about being real faithful to the original designs. So
his hands are bigger.
He's got those massive forearms and hands.
Just Kingdom Hearts.
And just this tiny little feet. Yeah.
You guys think there might be a Kingdom Hearts 3 final mix or 3.5? Better believe it. It will happen at some point in the future. The PS5 version. The PS5 version of Kingdom Hearts 3 will be 3.5.
Well, they're probably just going to keep making for 10, 20 years. So.
Let's see.
Going to get into game design.
We've talked about it, but
we've talked about it. We want to, but
it's a lot of work, man.
It is a lot of work. If we did it, it would be a 2D, 16-bit kind of game. It wouldn't be a big thing.
Ice-T, we're very excited about Octopath Traveler on the Switch. We're all looking forward to it.
Oh my gosh, like crazy, yeah. That's the game I want to play. That's coming out in the rest of the year.
Mike, do you think the gory and sexual tones of Occidental RPGs can make JRPGs flop here? Occidental? Not sure I know exactly. Are you talking about like maybe something like The Witcher? The way The Witcher handles gore and sexual content? If that were to put... I'm not sure. Ask the question again. Clarify. Let's see. Maybe just a couple more here.
Kiara Odyssey says, do we think Nomura leaving 15 helped or hurt it? And it's just kind of both.
I think it
hurt it a lot.
Themes.
Yeah. It helped it come out by 2016.
It helped the game get done. Yeah. Oh, shoot. I'm losing you guys. Well, that's probably means we're at the end.
But 3DS does not appear to be coming to the West. Anyways. All right, guys.
Okay. That's what we got. That's all we got for today. Thank you for watching.
That's all we
got. This will eventually come out audio only. If you do end up listening to that, there's a video you can watch on YouTube, Dark Pixel Gaming. Come check out our YouTube channel. Until next week, thank you guys for supporting the channel, for watching, and have a great week. Peace out.
Later.
Yeah.